Hi everybody, it's great to be back here again. Tomorrow is Friday. Let's get right down to our Torah lesson. Pesach was fantastic. We had a beautiful holiday here. Tomorrow was amazing. It just, wow, it's the holiday of redemption. You feel the lights of redemption coming down. But of course, living in Israel, we know that leaving Egypt was nothing compared to what's going to be in the future. Coming here and building the land, of course, was the most greatest event in history. But God says the days will come and the prophets that will forget about the first redemption, and we will talk about the second redemption, right? It's now returning us to the land of Israel, the final redemption of building the temple. So, wow, that's going to be, we have an expression in Hebrew, kesef katan. That small change to what the final redemption is going to be. And here we are in Israel with the lights of this final redemption. And Yom Ha'atzmaut on the way. Israel's Independence Day is coming up, and that reflects the final redemption of building the third temple. So we have a lot to look forward to, and it all comes from our learning of Torah. And being holy, wow, that connects us to the name of this week's portion, Kidoshim. God says to Moshe Rabbeinu, tell the people of Israel, you must be holy because I am holy. What is holiness all about? Holiness really begins over here, right in the head. It has to do with our thought process, because before we act, before we speak, which are actions, a kind of action, thought, speech, it begins in what our mindset, what do we invest ourselves during the day and during the night, what are our thoughts about, what do we want to do? And that's where will is so powerful that it's the highest level. It's called the keter in our esoteric teachings. The keter is the will, because from it all begins up here. What we want, eventually it turns to our thoughts, and then it goes into our hands, actions, our heart first. Heart is the different in our emotions and how we do, we bring about, and of course our hands and feet to make it happen, to build it, to do it. And that's a whole level of bringing something into fruition. And it could be a good thing, God forbid, or it could be a good thing, or God forbid, or it could be a bad thing. And therefore, our thought process is all about where we are and how we stand. And the being holy begins here. This week's portion opens up right away, God telling us, be holy, and then it says you must fear your parents. Having, again, respect for our parents who brought us into this world, to be recognized, recognition, and not take something for granted. We say in Hebrew, hakarat tov. And being respecting our parents is connected, of course, to respecting God, having hakarat tov, being, again, not taking for granted that we're here, we're alive, we're breathing air every single day that God gives us the breath of life. And this connects us, of course, in both realms to God. How? Because there's commandments in the Torah between Adam leMakom, between God and man, which is, again, doing Shabbat and all the thousands of laws we have, 613 commandments, but divided out into different branches, we know, now oral law, and of course the laws between man and man, how we respect our neighbors and how we relate to society, which begins at home with our parents and our family, etc., branches out. And holiness is a completeness. But this next portion goes on in chapter 20 to talk about, again, the most difficult challenge for people in the world, human beings, we know, are sexual offenses. People, unfortunately, there's terrible things going on in the world of people not being loyal to their spouses and cheating on one another, and terrible things going on of sexual offenses. And here the Torah is saying, in order to be holy, God's saying, I want the people of Israel to be a holy nation. They must adhere very, very strictly to the laws of these laws of sexual offenses, and not, God forbid, transgress. This together will make you holy, and this will make you connected to me and make you reach prophecy. If you want to reach prophecy, you must be holy. It can't happen. A person can't be a prophet and not be a holy person. With this in mind, I want to focus on one particular commentary. Ibn Ezra was one of the great Rishonim, one of the earliest commentaries in that period. And he brings down an important question, in his language. Maybe I'll read his language, but in order to understand, I have to give a little bit of background, and then I'll read his difficult language to understand what he's saying. But we see how great these commentaries are. With a hint, a few words, you have to try to figure out what they're trying to say and what was the point he was making. But first of all, to understand, Acharei Mod in Kidoshim, last week's portion called Acharei Mod, and this week's portion, Kidoshim, are connected, and most of the time they're read together. But they're connected in the fact that Acharei Mod talks about when it refers to sexual offenses, it mentions the warnings. We call in Hebrew the azharot, to warn, etc. It gives a whole list, but doesn't mention the punishments. So we learn from the Torah that God must warn us before He punishes us. And this week's portion talks about the actual punishments of different sexual offenses. For example, if we look in chapter 20, in this week's portion, it says, I'll pick out any verse. Where I'm at. Okay, I'll just read a verse. It goes on. If you look, why don't you really get to the beginning of it? So let's say if you look in chapter 20, verse number 10, it says, "V'ish asher yinaf et eshet ish." A person commits adultery. Asher yinaf et eshet re'eu, mod yumat no'ef v'no'afet. So what is the punishment? The capital punishment for adultery. It's listed right here, and it goes on. It goes on. A whole list, beginning again at chapter 20, verse number 10. But when we get up to verse number 19, it's very interesting. It doesn't mention the punishment. It just says, let's read it. Again, having a sexual relationship with your sisters, your mother's sister, which means your aunt or your father's sister, you must not have sexual relations with them. If they did, they're considered a family relationship, and they will bear their sin. But it doesn't explain in verse number 19, for some reason, the punishment. All the others, it mentions the punishment. Why in verse number 19 doesn't it mention the punishment? And not only that, if we look in last week's portion, it talks about one of the sexual offenses is marrying two sisters. And here, it doesn't mention at all the punishment of marrying two sisters. That's not mentioned. You don't even see it mentioned here. And this question is the Ibn Ezra, I said, is asking. He says like this, I'd like to read it. If you look at number 19, chapter 20, number 19, he asks that question. He says, Lo skir onesh achot ha'av. It didn't mention what the punishment of having relations with a father's sister, which was an aunt, and didn't mention klal at all the two sisters, shtei achayot. So he's saying, why didn't it mention it for? Any ideas, everybody? Why skip over all the other punishments it mentions? Not those two are missing. And he says, V'maskil yavin, the person who's smart will know. What does he mean? And he's also saying, Gam divrei ha-kabbalah emet, and also our traditions are true. He's hinting, he's not talking, he's talking in hints. But right away, if you look at the commentators, Rabbeinu B'chayeh, and if you look at the Abarbanel, they explain what the Ibn Ezra means. He's referring to the fact we have two great giants in Torah history that something happened. Let's begin with Yaakov Avinu, Jacob. What did Jacob do? He married two sisters. And who else married a prohibited, relationship? Amram, the father of Moses. He married his aunt. So the Torah says it right out in the Torah, that Amram married his aunt, and says that Jacob married two sisters. So therefore, the Ibn Ezra is saying, in order to honor them, he did not want to mention the punishment here in the Torah. That was what the Ibn Ezra said. But of course he did it in his very elegant way and hinted to it, but that's what he was referring to. He wanted to honor again Moshe Rabbeinu's father Amram, and he wanted to honor Jacob, Yaakov Avinu. Wow. But the question of course is, if we see in this week's portion that this is a sexual offense, and, well, it doesn't mention the punishment, but we know in our oral traditions, that's what the Ibn Ezra is saying, that our traditions are true. In our oral traditions, we know the punishment. It's brought down in the Talmud and the Mishnah for these sexual offenses of marrying two sisters or marrying an aunt. It's karet. It's not a capital punishment, but it's a punishment by God called karet. God cuts a person off. If there's a warning and witnesses, then there is something called makot, lashes. If that's the case, why did they go ahead and marry? Why did Jacob go ahead and marry two sisters? And why did Amram marry his aunt? So that's, of course, a great question. In order to answer that question, we'll make it a little deeper, is that our forefathers, we know, brought down in many sources, we know that they fulfilled the entire Torah by Ruach HaKodesh. By prophetic level, they knew to do the entire Torah. They knew that they weren't allowed to marry two sisters. And they knew they weren't allowed to marry their aunt. And of course they did all the other things in the Torah. But the fact that Jacob did, and the fact that Amram did, they saw in a spiritual way that here there was an exception, that they were allowed to. But if that's the case, really, the question is why? Why did Hashem, God could have easily brought it about a different way, that they would relate, a different way, they wouldn't have to transgress the Torah. At that point, they weren't really transgressing the Torah because the Torah wasn't given yet. But still, of course, it's a question. If it eventually would be wrong Why would they, in that situation, allowed to make the exception to the rule? It's a very difficult question, and there are many commentaries that try to deal with the question. And I'd like to focus on an interesting ma'amar, an interesting essay I saw. It brought down some sources, and we'll try to maybe try to shed some of my own light on understanding this. But before I do so, I want to bring down, a Gemara. There's a Talmud in the Tractate of Psachim. You look at page number 119. It talks about. Well, I'll bring it in front of us, and you can see that it's not a simple question at all. It brings down like this. It says, "Atid HaKadosh Baruch Hu lasot seudah latzadikim." God is in the future will make a seudah, a meal, a feast for the righteous. Biyom sheyigmol chasdo lezaro sheyitzchak, which means the day come when he will bring finally a goodness to the children of Isaac, which means when the redemption comes, it's going to be a very special meal, a very special feast coming in the redemption. And after everyone's sitting down and rejoicing in this redemption, this meal, those who are sitting down are going to take the cup, and they're going to give the cup of blessing. Now, what is the cup of blessing? We know that when we eat, when we sit down, we have a Jewish law, we sit down, you're supposed to take a cup of wine, and one person leads the zimun, it's called, he leads the blessing over wine. And everyone blesses, and then we bench. We bench meaning, what's the word in Yiddish? Meaning we bless, we mivarech, we make a blessing over the bread we ate, of the meal. And then they're going to turn to Abram. Abram's going to say, I can't bless. Why? Because Yishmael came out of me. Since Yishmael came out of my loins, I'm not willing to bless. So then they're going to turn to Yitzchak, Isaac, and say, I want you to bless. I said, I can't bless. Why? Because Esau came out of me. I can't bless either. Then I turn to Jacob, and Jacob's going to say, I can't bless. Why? Because I married two sisters. That's what it says here in the Talmud. And finally, the one who blesses eventually is going to be King David, which of course is a Mashiach. We know that King David from his. It's a very, very, again, the Gemara when it brings a story like this, it's all esoteric, it's hidden within a story, but it's very, very deep what's coming out of it. But we do see something interesting. We see here that Jacob did not want to bless. Because why? He married two sisters. So some kind of genai. Some kind of genai means some kind of stain over here that he ended up doing something that was eventually going to be wrong in the Torah. And of course, I think I'd like again to shed a little light here, but you can look at, there's so many different, again, commentaries on this to try to understand this very deep concept. But this reminds us of two areas. Number one, the first man we know married Cain, right? He married a Chava, and Cain, his children, were able to marry, they were allowed to marry their sisters, which is also prohibited in order to begin the world, the creation. And that was an exception to the rule as well. There are certain times there are exceptions to the rules in order to, of course, the deep reasons behind Hashem. Why did Hashem, the world have to begin, right? But we see way back then, that's how the world really began. And we see that also, very interesting, that Messiah comes out of an ancestral relationship. Lot and his daughters, Moab meaning from my father, right? Lot's daughters had relations with him. And from Moab, we know came Ruth. We're going to read about it coming up today's the 10th day of the Omer, but it's going to be coming up soon, the holiday of Shavuot. We'll be reading about it. And we see out of that ancestral relationship, eventually King David married, and that was all has to do with Messiah. So we see sometimes that from a very, very, something that seems like the furthest away from holiness, you will find holiness. And this is really, I think, in a deep understanding of what God commanded Jacob to marry two sisters, and what Amram, what Moses came from. And here, it's all Moses, of course, also all connected to Messiah, to Mashiach. And here, of course, Jacob, the whole house of Israel, began with this kind of relationship with two sisters, which was, again, forbidden. God's trying to show that eventually, the Torah straightens us out and gives us the boundaries of holiness, but that eventually the entire world will be cleansed, which means the most difficult situations, in one hand, you can look at and say, wow, this is so far away, but out of darkness and out of difficult situations, God was showing us that light can shine, and never give up hope. And even in a very, very bad situation, a person can feel, wow, I did something bad. What can I be? How can I be holy? God is showing, listen. Of course, you have to, today the Torah is binding to us all, and we can't, God forbid, transgress. But God is showing us, sometimes when a person has a falling and he falls, but there's still holiness, you can always turn around and turn yourself and become holy. And this is reflected in the fact that before the Torah was given, of course, Jacob was allowed to marry to us, although later on, but it was also showing us that sometimes things that are against logic, like a person could see, wow, he's in the worst place, he fell so bad, he's running around the worst places. And also this person turns around and becomes a great leader, a great Torah scholar, a great holy man. It can happen. It really can happen in any situation. And here really, it was reflected in the honor of Amram and Jacob, not to mention the punishment, to show that, to hint to that point. But anyway, this is an idea that came to mind. But again, we know that God's ways on the end of the day, the end of the day, we know that God's light is so great and we are so small. And sometimes it's hard to understand everything the way God brings about events. But we saw again, like I showed you before, the first man, Messiah, and here Moses and Jacob, the family. These great spiritual holiness comes from sometimes things which are to show. Sometimes there has to be a period of darkness before light will shine. This is an important principle we have to try to bring within our hearts. But again, God's light is so far beyond our understanding. It's a little touch to try to understand that important concept. But anyway, I think I'm going on a little too long here. Anyway, have a wonderful Shabbat. I miss you all. It's so great to be back. Love you all. Shabbat Shalom. Come and visit Itamar. And we're going to be celebrating our 30th year of Itamar's existence. Our birthday coming up on Yom Ha'atzmaut. I'm inviting you all to come and be part of that great celebration. Shabbat Shalom. U'mevorach.